Films in Focus with David Sterritt is underwritten by The Movie House, your destination for first-run Hollywood and independent movies, and a digital portal to the Met Opera, National Theatre Live, and special events worldwide in Millerton, New York, and on the web, themoviehouse.net.
David Sterritt is the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, contributing writer at Cineast, film professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and Robin Hood Radio's very own personal critic, who we really appreciate. He joins us weekly, the films The Invisibles and They Shall Not Grow Old. Was that a dramatic recitation? Is this as good as is this the best I can do?
I think you gave that a tremendously dramatic touch, and from here on out, it's all going to be anticlimax after that intro.
Yeah, well, it happens.
Yeah, well, anyway, two films this week. Yeah, they both have to do with war, although in very different ways. So let us begin with The Invisibles, which is a new movie, which is from Germany. And it's a Holocaust film. And I think probably every time I want to talk about Holocaust films, I'm reminded of a remark once made by my old friend Stuart Klawans, who is the excellent film critic for The Nation magazine. So I've probably mentioned this before, but when he once mentioned that he was going off to see a new Holocaust film, somebody said to him, "Oh, how many Holocaust films do there have to be?" And Stuart said that was a kind of an interesting question, and he thought, and he said, well, how many? Maybe 6 million might be one place we could start to think about this. And I think that's just an excellent response because, of course, the Holocaust is such a just overwhelmingly important topic for us to continue to think about, that there can never be too many films that deal with the subject. That said, we would hope that they would all be good films, and some are better than others. Some are more insightful, some are more revealing, some are simply more thoughtful than others. The Invisibles is a respectable and interesting and kind of unusual entry in that genre of Holocaust films. I can't say that it's one of the very best. It was directed by Klaus Raffle, who also co-wrote it. And the interesting twist about The Invisibles is the way in which it chooses to tell its story, which is it's a docudrama in the kind of the fullest sense of that term, which is to say it really does mingle documentary and scripted, acted, dramatic elements. And it combines those things in a way which is not 100% successful, but it certainly gives the movie a certain kind of liveliness and makes it interesting and kind of absorbing in ways that not all movies are. The basic idea of The Invisibles, it deals with 4 people who, when Berlin during the early 1940s was when all of the Jews were being rounded up, deported for purposes of either at first just deportation, getting them out of the city, and then being deported to death camps for extermination. There were some people who chose to go underground and to live in hiding, but right there in the city of Berlin. So, as you might say, they were hiding in plain sight, disguising themselves. One of the women that the film deals with, for example, made herself into a blonde. And living in housing, often by houses owned by non-Jews who are able, to keep right on living, but who were willing to shelter and hide these Jews. And the movie, again, there were quite a number of these people. Apparently there were well over 1,500 Jews in Berlin who managed to survive this period by going into hiding, by not submitting to the deportation. In some cases, as we see, especially in the early part of this movie, the rest of the family would be deported, and one member would say, I'm going to try to survive this thing by just staying in the city and trying to stay under the Nazis' radar. And this is the story of 4 of those people who, and again, it's all true stories. And these 4 people, 2 of them have died since they were filmed for the purposes of this movie. But we have these 4 people who appear on camera from time to time, narrating their story, and then we go from that person to the staged reenacted episodes. So again, we have this mixture of the real life people who actually did this, who are now very old, and again, a couple of whom have died since the film was actually shot, telling their story, intermixed with scenes of the reenacted stage scenes that are in the what we would normally see in a docudrama or just a fiction film about the Holocaust. Although this stuff is all based on reality. So these four people who we follow over the course of the film, one of them is a young woman named Hannah Levy. She's the one who turned herself blonde and went to the movies a whole lot, because in the movies you get to sit in the dark and you might not be noticed. Then again, when you're a very attractive young woman, you might be noticed, and that becomes a problem once or twice in the film. Another one is a young graphic artist who got himself work forging passports for other people who wanted to get out of the city. And he would be paid for this with food ration stamps, which he was able to sell and support himself that way. Kind of interesting. There's another woman, two men and two women, another woman who pretended to be a war widow and went to work as a maid for a Nazi. And then the fourth person is a young man who eventually joined a resistance group. So we have these four people, and again, we are having their stories enacted, intermixed with the footage of the real people in their old age telling what happened. One of the things that is so interesting about the movie, and that I really enjoyed a lot, is seeing those four real people narrating the story. They are all good-humored, smart, lively people. They're not decrepit oldsters. I myself am a semi-decrepit oldster. They're older than I am because they were all. I was a little tiny kid when in fact I was a baby when this was going on. They were not babies at all, but they are very, very lively and often witty and good-humored people who years and decades later seem to still find it hard to believe their good fortune that they survived it all, and they really enjoy telling what happened, and especially those who were sheltered by non-Jews are very, very eager to tell about these terrific people. The movie paints a portrait of Germany at the time, and Berlin specifically at the time, which is not, it was nothing but Nazi evil. Nazi evil was everywhere, but there were these wonderful people who did not succumb to that evil, wonderful people who sheltered us and put themselves in risk for the most horrible kinds of consequences, and they did this even though they did not have to. And so that's often a feature of Holocaust movies, but in this case I think it's especially moving. I don't think that the documentary and the docudrama aspects of the Invisibles really quite blend together as smoothly as they might, but again, it's an unusual and an interesting way of telling this story, and I must add that the film actually has a subtitle. The full title is The Invisibles, We Want to Live, and that's basically what it comes down to. It's the story of people who wanted to live and who succeeded in living with the help of others, the kindness of strangers, so to speak. So it's a very nice movie, even though it is also a reminder of the extraordinary horrors of the Holocaust. Speaking of horrors of long ago, this brings us to They Shall Not Grow Old, which is a new movie by Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson, of course, is best known for extravagant fantasies like all those Lord of the Rings movies that he made, in which I, by the way, am not all that much of an admirer of, although they're hugely popular. So that is what Peter Jackson is most famous for. But there's another side to his filmmaking personality, and we certainly see that here, because They Shall Not Grow Old is a straight-out documentary. And it is a documentary made from footage of World War I soldiers. And that is what this is. This is now a story of World War I told entirely through footage, film material that was shot during the war in the actual battlefields of the war and nearby and surrounding areas and so forth. And what happened was that Peter Jackson was approached by the Imperial War Museums, who came to him and they said, we have 100 hours of footage which were shot on and near the battlefields of World War I. and we would really like to get this footage out to the public, have it restored, have it put back into so that it looks the way it looked when it was new, which is fabulous looking film. Film shot way back in the World War I era. Cameras were very sophisticated in those days, and footage that was shot at the time looks wonderful. It often looks awful when we see it nowadays because the film is old and scratched and faded and torn and everything else, and because it's often shown at wrong projection speeds. But the footage looked terrific when it was new. And so they said, we have this footage. Now it's old and creaky, but we would like to have it restored and to present it to the public. What do you think, Peter Jackson, about the way we might do this? So Peter Jackson set to work on this project, taking this 100 hours of material, and a whole lot of challenges presented themselves. But he went to work and has come out with a movie which we now have, which is called They Shall Not Grow Old. The title is a very poignant one. So what he did was, first of all, the idea was to restore the footage. And I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of this. It's quite a fascinating process that he went through. But to restore the footage, first of all, one of the things they had to do was to get the correct speed. That's one of the big problems when we see old silent movie footage in this day and age. Silent movie footage back in those days, first of all, it was silent. And the cameras were hand cranked. There was a camera operator who would be turning the crank, and the crank speed was not always consistent, and different operators had different speeds at which they would crank it. Only when sound cinema came in the 1920s did camera speeds and projector speeds get standardized. So the idea is, one of the things they had to do was figure out what is the proper speed at which to show this footage. Then also you had to do all kinds of work to get rid of all the splotching and decay and just damage done over the course of time to the footage itself. So what they did was they got the projection speeds right, a tremendous task in itself. They cleaned up the footage using all kinds of our modern electronic technology, and they got the footage restored so that it looks pretty much probably the way it looked when it was new. It's just really dazzlingly fresh in the way that it looks now. Then the idea was, what kind of sound are we going to use here? And Jackson used different methods of putting sound to this. Now, the first big decision was they decided to have a sort of not a narration, but they decided to have commentary that would be done entirely by veterans of that period. Now, there were about 600 hours of oral histories in the archives. So Jackson was going through not only the 100 hours of actual movie footage, but about 600 hours of archival oral histories taken during the 60s and 70s with veterans who were still around and who were recounting their experiences. So they then culled all of this footage, the 100 hours of footage, down to roughly 90 minutes, because that's about how long the movie is, a little over an hour and a half. And they winnowed the 600 hours of oral histories down to a similar amount of time, and they then juxtaposed the oral history testimonies of these veterans speaking in the 60s and 70s, recalling their experiences in the war, with footage that was shot back at that time, and the whole thing comes out to a documentary again, which is a little over an hour and a half long from all this material. Now, in order to make a movie of standard movie-going length for nowadays, Jackson had to focus on certain kinds of footage, so they had to just eliminate all kinds of stuff. And what they eventually did was to decide to focus on the trench warfare on the Western Front. So that's what we see in the movie, and we see a kind of the movie has a very definite shape to it. There's the kind of lead up to the war, people going off to serve in the war, often lying about their age when they were too young because they wanted to go off and fight in the war, and then we have an enormous amount of footage of the war itself, and then by the end the whole thing is winding down, and we have the talk about what the aftermath was going to be like. So I have mixed feelings about it. This movie has been getting absolutely ecstatic reviews from critics everywhere, and that's rightly so. It's a remarkable thing, and it's terrific to see this footage restored in all kinds of ways. I question Jackson's decision to colorize the footage, which he did. He said, if the people who were shooting the footage back at the time had been able to choose between black and white, because there was no color cinematography at that time, they all would have chosen color. That may be true, but it gives the footage to me a kind of a falsely modern look. This footage, all World War I footage was shot in black and white, and that's the way we've always seen it before, and I think it should have been left that way. Plus the fact that the material looks colorized. The color doesn't look natural. The technology just really doesn't exist to make it look completely real nowadays, and I'm afraid that I didn't find that part of it very convincing. That said, a few other caveats I have about the film. There is so much that is left off. We're getting such a selective picture. It's such a partial portrait of what actually went on with that horrendous war. But, it's a marvelous reminder of what war was like at that period. And it's just seeing this footage and the savagery and the horror of it, because there's a tremendous amount of violence and cut up bodies and all of that we see over the course of the film. It's just a reminder of the savagery and horror of war itself. And I think that the way They Shall Not Grow Old has emerged, it's, among other things, a very, very effective anti-war movie. So I hope everybody goes and sees it. I don't think it's a perfect film, even of its kind, but it's a remarkable document. And again, it's a yet bazillionth reminder, but we can never have too many reminders of the horror of war the way it used to be and the way it still is today. So that is my somewhat war-torn story this week, Jill.
Thank you very much, David Sterritt. Films in Focus, the films, The Invisibles, and They Shall Not Grow Old.